editorial director. He'll be working with you for the whole week with all the content that's going on here. I'm Jeff Lochner, president of MediaPost, and when I got it started with Ken back in 1996, and the internet was a $0 billion business, I think the duopoly, honestly, was Alta Vista and Excite. Seriously, and that duopoly was replaced, it seemed like a big scary duopoly, by Netscape and Yahoo. So anyway, we're moving into multiple duopolies here. Welcome again. This is Steve Smith. He's going to kick us off and get us going. If you need anything, I'm around, Steve's around, John Whitfield, who you met, is around. Jumyun Sun, who is our director of event brands, is back in the back helping to do the videos. We're live streaming everything we're doing. Elaine is out on the front desk. Anyway, if you need a MediaPost person, hook us up. Here you go, Steve.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to some of you. We've been doing this now on our 5th edition, and it's good to see that we have some regulars already to the summit. We tried something unique here, where we really have peer-to-peer exchanges in a format that really allows that and encourages an exchange of ideas. And I'll talk about that in a second. But as Jeff said, we are among those of you who are struggling through this time. We are among the old farts of digital media. MediaPost is 20 years old, started in 1996. And I myself, let's bring up that first slide just to show you how old a fart I am, an even older fart than the company. I started covering digital media and the magazines and the transition of traditional media into digital back in 1994 when I was still a professor at UVA. I made that weird pivot from teaching at UVA to covering the latest trends in digital media. I was writing back, now here, this is going to really bring you back. Does anybody remember Cyber Surfer magazine? It was the first print magazine to cover digital. Now there was an idea, and I was covering some of this. I believe that Virtual Valerie, the digital sex assistant story, was mine, and it was edited by, my first editor in digital was Jason Calacanis. That's where he started as the editor of Cyber Surfer magazine, and then I wrote also for Min's New Media Report. I was the editor of Min's New Media Report. Was one of the first print bi-weeklies covering the digital industry and especially the transition of old media to new. I wrote for ZDNet, and if any of you remember Happy Puppy. I was writing for Happy Puppy back in 1997. And I mention all of this because in some ways I've been writing the same story for 20 years. And the story of consolidation and the drive towards performance media and the consequences of digital disruption have really been there all along. And I seem to have been, in covering that transition, I seem to have been writing the same story about how everyone in digital, everyone in the major legacy media brands are just waiting to unlock all of those TV brand budgets that eventually are going to come to TV. And I've been writing the same story about every new innovation, every new model, every new media company that thought that they had unlocked the key to finally take brand advertising, that thing that was driving television, that was driving all of that money elsewhere, and bring it into digital. And we kept writing this story again and again and again, and kept covering the story, even as the numbers suggested otherwise, even though the stats and all the metrics were showing that things like search, email, performance-based advertising, they really continue to define this medium. And that was the struggle we always had, is really facing up to the reality of the depth of this disruption that was going on, how we were starting to see the erosion of scarcity, the thing that really had driven all those bucks into media for so long, being the gatekeepers for all of that attention. To being able to funnel and to push it through those scarce channels that were worth so much. The erosion of brand loyalty among users, that they weren't really going to stick with your brand. They didn't love our brands as much as we thought. They really were willing to dance across a lot of different brands to collect what they needed to consume. The erosion of user experience. We kept claiming that we were going to make it feel and look better. We were going to make it feel and look like TV, like magazines. We were going to immerse people in these wonderful experiences. And we found out people didn't mind the crap of a Facebook feed. They really didn't mind how bad YouTube was. They actually were going to live with those experiences. And this was a tremendous disappointment for those of us who invested so much time and energy in building those things and loving those things and using those things. The fragmentation of attention and the advantage that platforms always seem to have in aggregating that fragmenting attention. These were all realities that went back, even back to 1995 and 1996. And a lot of the folly and the failure that I covered over those years really attached themselves to the belief, the faith that somehow we could bend those curves. We could move them back. We could move users back to user experience. We could move advertisers away from performance and back towards brand advertising. And a lot of them ended up being rearguard actions. But there were forces driving a lot of digital media and a lot of digital change that were actually even deeper than the technology and deeper than the major players, the oligarchy of digital players that thought they were driving it. There really were cultural forces behind this that had to do with the democratization and the fragmentation of attention, the democratization of media and media creation, where authority was shifting in the culture generally. And ultimately, when the story of digital is written, it's going to be written not just about the power brokers and the digital and technology companies driving things, but an underlying current and changes that had been started way back in the invention of cable television in the 1970s. We were seeing that fragmentation begin. We were seeing the balance of power starting to move back towards the users and away from centralized media companies. And the media oligopoly, of course, is not new. This has been the story of media for centuries. Local newspaper monopolies, radio, film distribution, and now even telecom. They all have gone through this story of having centralized power and centralized money. The history of the FCC is the history of regulating and moderating these flows of money, these concentrations of power. And there's even an existential question there under all of this. Even though we complain about the duopoly and we feel the unfairness of all that revenue and power going towards two major platforms now, there is a real existential question we all still have to ask about whether a duopoly of relatively open, user-driven platforms is more beneficial to diverse free speech than an oligopoly of media. Because after all, we're in a bit of a glass house. We also have seen the centralization of media power around a few large major media companies, and that itself has raised a set of questions. So when we look on the oligopoly of digital media, we really have to consider which is worse, an oligopoly of media and content power or an oligopoly of distribution and revenue power. But somehow in just this last year, we've woken up to these realities, and honest to God, it seems to me that they've been here all along. I seem to have been covering them all along. But it's really in this last year that we start talking about this big duopoly structure. And so we have started to visually scare ourselves. And I'm just going to dance us through a whole set of charts here that we've been throwing up to scare ourselves over the last year over this concentration of wealth and power around two. Just a couple of years ago, we were already starting to see the share of the digital ad market concentrate very, very obviously among these two major players, and this is just from 2 years ago. The fear takes visual form in a lot of different ways, and a lot of it depends on how you're counting and parsing it. If you include search in that, then suddenly Google takes on an enormous amount of power. But we see that descending line and how few players are grabbing so much of the money, and how virtually none of you are on this chart. This is one of the scarier ones in recent years, which simply shows the incredible shrinking amount of the other category, all of you, that started just a few years ago at half of revenue and is now creeping down to 34% and going even lower. And then this is the one that really scared us most recently, and Jason's actually going to be talking about this in a second on a little later on our panel. If you can run the numbers in a lot of chilling ways, and one of the scariest is to parse it out in terms of growth. Not just where the revenue's going, but where it's growing. And in this one, if you just tease out the concentration of growth, you actually see a contraction among all but the major two players. And to go back to the raw numbers, this one of the more recent charts about projecting mobile revenue, which is where most of the action is, paints an even harsher picture, because then we see that by 2019, at least according to eMarketer's projections, we're talking about 60% of mobile ad revenues going to Google and Facebook. So no matter how you visualize these numbers, the digital economy may look in a lot of different ways dire. It feels a lot more like this, to those of you who were a little younger and remember the movies involving the Kraken, or if you're old farts like me, more like this, who remember the old Hammer films. And I should note, by the way, that speaking of vampires, that both Google and Facebook were invited to this party. Both declined. But this is not a pity party. And the idea of this event, and the way we structured this, is not to just wring our hands over the power and the revenue concentration in two players. This summit is really about recognizing the economic context in which we're working and exploring what's working for media companies. How are they starting to learn how to thrive here within this context? So today, for instance, we're going to look at the general strategic response to the duopoly economy, how companies are experiencing it, how they're responding to it, where they're starting to see daylight, how premium publishers are trying to sell media buyers on the idea of quality, and how against a duopoly that very often represents bad user experiences, how quality, premium, guaranteed, and safe environments really are of special value and maybe greater value. Tomorrow we're going to drill into growth sectors for media. We're going to talk about video, we're going to talk about programmatic and especially header bidding, but we'll also be talking about the productizing of data and that as a promising area for publishers, especially if they start partnering together. And we'll be looking at emerging tech like VR. Finally, on the third day, we'll be looking at content, the brand studios, native, and the ways in which we're starting to move away from traditional advertising and how well that's profiting. Few words about the summit itself as a structure. For those of you who are new, by the way, how many of you are new to a MediaPost Insider Summit? Okay. So the idea is everything we do on stage here, we're MediaPost, we're a media company, everything on stage is on the record. We're live streaming it over MediaPost.com. If you have friends back in the office, ping them, tell them they can tune in now. We'll also be posting those videos, usually by the end of the day, back on the agenda at our site. But everything off stage, starting at around noon, is off the record, unless you specifically give permission to me or our reporter, Eric Sass. By the way, here's Eric Sass, who's the editor of our Publishing Daily. You'll be seeing him later, and he'll also be reporting from the event, whether you give us explicit permission to use something. And that pertains enough how the roundtables really are the center of what we do. A lot of the content on here in the morning is really beginning. They're open discussion from the morning. How you're about which one you want. As many of you know, voices that a lot of you are bring it on with my growing new almost all around programmatic and the ways in which people, and we're going to hear a lot about that tomorrow, the ways in which a lot of you are leveraging programmatic in smarter ways to move pricing upwards and to optimize that, the yield and the revenue stream. So digital marketing has been, I'll just quote some of these, and a lot of these are direct quotes from your responses to me. Digital marketing has some of the best attribution tools, so the rise of people or audience-based targeting is not a surprise, programmatic and native. Better programmatic optimization, both in the US and internationally. Data-driven products, specifically audience-based marketing. And this is, of course, a phrase that we're going to be hearing throughout the year, and we heard it from our sponsor earlier in the day. People-based marketing is really the buzzword. We just finished a summit for email marketers, and it was on everyone's lips. It's the way that people are going to conceive of this category, at least for the next year or two. And brand direct programmatically served, the shift among, and we're going to see this when we get into the category about contracting revenue streams, the shift of media buying, especially on the agency side, towards programmatic platform and automation has really accelerated in the last couple of years. So the brand direct programmatically bought advertising is really starting to move into the automated marketplaces now, especially private marketplaces, and this has been a big driver of revenue for some. Also video, we're going to hear a little bit more about this, but I was a little surprised in a lot of the responses how much of it was really talking about programmatic and less about some of the categories I would have expected to be highlighted as centers of growth. The private marketplaces, which continue to grow. Interestingly, events. We didn't include events in this agenda, but we may in the coming agenda. And responses that I got. Seeing a degree going on there. The traditional agency models, and again, this is how and where media are bought and from sources is an interesting transformation that's going on right now because, of course, as media is going through crisis, the agency world is going through crisis and the ways in which it's buying media. So the idea of how publishers are interacting with the major agencies is an interesting transformation that's going on right now, especially as they go through a crisis regarding their trading desks. So working directly with agencies seems to be something that's coming under pressure. Traditional direct sales. Traditional direct sales within the publishing companies is something that's struggling, and a lot of them seem to continue to struggle with the new technology and adopting it, even though the technology is available to them. And subscription revenue was mentioned. And then I asked about the state of the relationship with Google and Facebook. If they're frenemies, where are they now? Are they more friend or enemy? And there was diverse views here, all according to how different publishers are relating to the various power structures. I love this one. Our Google relationship borders on mean girls. They don't help, but boy, can they hurt us. We can't exactly bite the hand that feeds us, but boy, I wish we could. I think that sentiment is shared broadly. I would call them more of a friend. We've tried to manage the ever-changing rules that Facebook and Google implement while looking to work with them more on some of the emerging technologies like 360 and VR. There are some stories, by the way, in the press today about a little, and something that we'll be talking about, I think, over the next few days is whether we're starting to see the duopoly come up with revenue sharing structures that are a little more advantageous for their major media partners. In B2B, perhaps more when we can access their inventory via partners. Enemy for anyone who's stuck on a traditional digital. We'll be talking about this in our first panel, I think. And we rely heavily on Facebook's inventory and API, always friendly. And then finally, I overhyped that we're experiencing is overused but not overhyped. This is an interesting point. It may come up, I think, in our content panel on day 3. The ways in which media brands really can leverage influencer marketing more wisely, especially in the social channels. In many ways, they can help preempt and supplant some of the influencer marketing brokers. They might also be able to help, I think, in the pricing problems that influencer marketing has right now. Exactly how you value this stuff may be easier to value within the context of broader media buys. It's taking away from the solid news organizations and the good work that they do. Branded content, it's just this is an interesting point. We'll take this up on day 3. It's just a fancy name for infomercials. It undermines quality journalism and confuses readers. In this day and age of alternative facts, branded content needs to be very clearly delineated. OTT, that's an interesting point. It'll come up in our video panel. Whether, especially traditional media brands, especially those who really have their footprint and their legacy in print, whether they really are effectively making a transition and leveraging the OTT channel that everyone seems to see growing, but whether it's really translating into individual publishing brands is another question. And finally, data is the oil of the 21st century. I think we'll be taking that up tomorrow when we talk about when we talk about data in particular as a product. But we're going to start, one of the themes that's going to go throughout of the next few days is valuing quality journalism and the intersection of quality in content and quality in environments with the value of advertising. So it's fitting that we start with a keynote from John Avlon, who's been thinking hard about the overlap of bad content, fake news, and business success. He is the editor-in-chief and the managing director of the Daily Beast. He's also, you'll recognize him, I think, immediately as a CNN political analyst who's been in the thick of the arguments over fake news and their role in the last election. He's been a columnist at the Daily Beast since 2008, shortly after Tina Brown launched it. Prior to that, he was at the New York Sun as a columnist. He served as the chief speechwriter for the New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, and he's also the author of Independent Nation, How Centrists Can Change American Politics, and Wingnuts, How the Lunatic Fringe is Hijacking America. Please welcome John Avlon.
All right, well, we got a lot. This is definitely a conference that's going to be focused on a lot of the trends that are driving our business, but not just our business. I think we need to accept the fact that these are trends that are also driving society. And this is a jump ball moment for our country. I like to call this America's civic stress test. And we're going to get through it, but we're only going to get through it if we all take responsibility for doing it. And I'm here to talk a little bit about life on the front lines of digital media right now against the headwinds of an unusually and historically not normal political environment emanating from the White House. I'm here to preach the gospel of quality news and to talk about how combating fake news and hate news can not only be good journalism, but I believe it can be good business. But let's start by understanding that what's happening right now in our country, the headwinds we are facing emanating from the White House, at least with regards to talks about how journalism is an enemy of the American people, how confronting fake news and hate news and concepts like alternative facts, this is not normal. This is a challenge to a lot of the core responsibilities that journalism exists to address from the highest office in the land. And, some folks in the White House believe that they're at war with the media. I think the reality is that they're at war with the truth, and it's our job to help advance that. And I'm not saying that from a partisan perspective. I'm an independent for what it's worth. I worked for Rudy Giuliani for many years as a young man. This is about focusing on core values and what our purpose is as journalists and publishers, not only in the economics of our society, but in the structure of our society as intended by the Founding Fathers. I just wrote a book on George Washington's farewell address, so I've been steeped in this a little bit when I haven't been dealing with the rise of now President Trump. I'll be actually doing the Daily Show tomorrow night to talk about the book and some of these themes. But a couple of things to remember for those of us in the publishing business, whether you focus on news or something more specialized. Our Constitution doesn't mention political parties, but it does mention a free press. What we do is actually part of the structure the Founding Fathers envisioned as being a constraint on power as much as the division of power between the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. Washington in his farewell address made the point that democracies depend on, quote, enlightened opinion. That's a core part of the idea of a self-governing society. You can't just dumb it down to bread and circuses or have fake news hijack concepts of reality and hope that we're going to be able to muddle along and maybe we can have some version of wealth with less liberty. It's not going to work that way. And our generation is going to be judged by what we do now, not only in terms of the journalism we produce, but the brands we build and how we address the business model challenge that our industry is facing. That's a piece of the equation as well. And I think when we look back on this time, we're going to view this as the best time to be journalists, the best time to be publishers. Not because it was easy, but because it was hard and because our mission was clear. Our generation's responsibility is to be standing up to a lot of these challenges we're facing and trying to solve them. The business side as well, and businesses and advertisers are going to be part of that, as much as technology and the content itself. So this is a jump ball moment in our history. That makes it exciting, but we're going to have to fight hard. I believe that good journalism and good business can go together, and I'm optimistic about where we are despite all the storm clouds we're facing on the horizon. Well, they're not even on the horizon anymore. They're on us. You know, one of my favorite quotes is from Abraham Lincoln. He said, "I'm an optimist because I don't see the point in being anything else. But there are huge opportunities amid the responsibilities we face. This isn't going to be easy, but if we do it right, it's going to be fun, and it sure as hell is going to be purposeful." So I believe very quickly that all addresses should basically, this is the old speechwriter in me, should talk a little bit about where we've been, where we are, and then focus on the future, where we're going. I think we need to talk about the decline in trust in media and the valuation of media itself. I want to talk about what news needs to do now in combating hate news and fake news. And then finally, how publishers can help advertisers see their very real responsibility in changing the dynamics, the economic dynamics of our industry right now in a form of almost patriotic capitalism, driven by enlightened self-interest. Because I do think the concept of the duopoly, which you're all going to be marinating in for much of this conference, I think there's a major argument to be made that businesses need to invest directly in quality news producers. That's a way to actually protect their brands, but it's also a way to do well by doing good amid a tide of fake news and hate news. So first of all, let's take a little bit of responsibility and talk about the decline in trust in media. Donald Trump didn't invent it, but he certainly exploited it. And his message resonated with his supporters because there has been a decades-long decline in trust in media that precedes Donald Trump. I think you could trace it to the rise of partisan media. And let's be empathetic about the reason right-wing media was created. It was an attempt to balance implicit bias on the part of mainstream media with explicit bias. And that became a business model. It met an unmet need. People were wanting to hear that, and I think we need to understand that. At the same time, we also need to understand that that business model became increasingly cynical, that it coincided with the fragmentation of the broader media environment, and what is sometimes called cocooning. It focused on appealing to a narrow but intense niche audience. And the only way you could keep that narrow and intense niche audience in work under the assumption that people really didn't care about who did it first. And if you could game an algorithm, you'd gain financial benefit. But that, of course, put the people doing the hard work, the expensive work of creating quality journalism at a potential competitive disadvantage. And that's where we need to start readjusting the scales as well, all of us. The impacts of this have been profound, right? Instead of having an amazing opportunity to have access to more information than ever before, people have self-segregated themselves into separate political realities. That's incredibly dangerous for a society, and that's where we are right now. Also, we've seen the devaluation of real news not only through content farms, but by, frankly, people trying to grow consistent with disrespecting the audience's intelligence. You know, not only bread and circuses and celebrity gossip, but really feeding them a bunch of crap perpetuated through algorithms and getting rich in the short run, but creating absolutely no value in the long run. And in some ways, fake news is the culmination of these two trends, and it came about very quickly. Right? I mean, this is not something that was a concept until less than a year ago. And in part, under accusations that individual bias among trending news teams inside Facebook was being influenced on the liberal side, Facebook pulled the goalie, and an amazing thing happened. There was a proliferation of fake news. This is began by some people as satirical sites. The Daily Beast reporter Ben Collins found one of the initial people who created a fake news site. And he began it. He was an anti-Trump Republican who was trying to do a satirical news site, trying to show how gullible people were, to sort of mock the anger and absurdity of some of these folks' beliefs. And he ended up finding out that this was quite profitable. He wasn't the only one. People who were, dedicating themselves to fake news sites found themselves making $10,000 a month. Well, that's real good money. And I'm not talking about the folks in Macedonia. You do the conversion rate. But this had a massive effect. And let's define the terms and define why it proliferated. Because fake news is not what the White House says it is. It's not simply news that makes you politically discomfort because it criticizes the official party line. No. Fake news is fundamentally false stories written with the intent to deceive. Now, sometimes they pursue a political agenda. They're propagandistic. Other times they're really simply cynical ways to try to make money off broad programmatic ad buys. And that's, by the way, where we need to stop it. And I'll get to that in a second. But in almost all cases, their confirmation bias meets clickbait. And that's where we all have to look in the mirror, because the environment we've created technologically has allowed these viruses to proliferate because they feed off what people seem to want in the short run. Confirmation bias, clickbait. There's a profit motive as well as a propagandistic end. And what's been released is incredibly dangerous to democracy, not only our own. And we need to understand that as a real threat. And indeed, intelligence agencies, not just the former FBI Director James Comey, but even more recently, the British intelligence agencies are warning about the impact of fake news and these sort of troll farms as real threats to democracy because they undermine our sense of a common currency of communication. They undermine our sense of faith in our democracy. And that is about as dangerous as it gets. Because democracies and civic institutions are built on trust. And if that's being actively attacked for reasons of profit or politics, we're in real trouble. So what should news do? First of all, I think to combat hate news and fake news, one of the things news needs to do now is really try to set itself apart from the spin. The value in news comes from edgy, original reporting, offered without fear or favor. I think news needs to do two things right now. We need to call bullshit, and we need to make important stories interesting. We need to do that unapologetically. Now, I believe that the Daily Beast, certainly, I know we aim to be nonpartisan but not neutral. What does that mean? That means that we will hit both sides as the facts demand, but we will not drift into a mythic moral equivalence of on the one hand, on the other. The key quote for me is from Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. And one of the things we need to do as journalists is insist upon a fact-based debate. Now, I'm a former columnist. I love opinion. Personally, I love reported opinion. That's my favorite form. And we want to have great opinion, but I also think opinion on sites in particular shouldn't commit the sin of predictability. Right? That's why we at the Beast have got columnists who run the gamut from liberal to libertarian, and that's important. But we do original reporting, and we don't carry water for any political party or political ideology. And that's what the growth of hate news has done to an absurd and dangerous extent. I think as part of that, we need to understand that simply trying to grow sites through sugar high, right, through either pay for play, which is epidemic and not discussed enough in our industry, or by sort of cheap sugar high growth, clickbait, side door traffic, that is actually the wrong marker for what we're trying to achieve as journalists. It really is publishers. We want brand differentiation no matter what side of this business you're in. That's going to depend on quality and influence. And we believe at the Daily Beast that influence matters more than scale for its own sake. That's why you can't be dependent upon someone else's platform. You're renting your audience, not owning it. You need to earn loyalty. And that's why I think it's time actually for a new metric, and we're working on rolling this out at the Daily Beast, that looks at not only growth and the audience size. I'm proud that we've grown, but more important, how we've grown. We reach more than 1 million people a day. That's great. But it's not the only measure of success, particularly if you're looking at influence. We need a new metric that balances traffic and page views with engagement and loyalty and influence. which may be measured by something like Twitter verified social shares. We need a weighted average of those things to come up with a real metric of influence and value and start using that internally and ultimately, I think, externally. We need a smarter way of gauging the success of a piece of content than simply scale, which can be purchased, and which really has no value if people click on it for a second by accident. The real value is created by creating loyalty. That's best measured by engagement and influence. All right, so let's talk about the role that businesses not only can play, but I think need to play to put this genie back in the bottle with regard to fake news and hate news. One of my mantras in our business is that we vote for president every 4 years, but we vote with our eyeballs and our wallets every day. And we need to take responsibility for that as consumers. Everybody does. What they click on. If you click on, cheap trash, you're going to get more cheap trash. If you click on more quality news, you'll probably get more quality news. But here's the thing. Businesses have a greater responsibility than I think they recognize, and more power than perhaps they commonly understand, to change the equation right now. But they're starting to get hip to it, and this is something I wrote a column about a few weeks ago, and it's kind of fascinating. A couple of examples just from the last 2 or 3 months. A group of online activists called Sleeping Giants started to take to task places that were advertising on Breitbart, which is sort of the alt-right mecca, which was very influential in the rise of Donald Trump. We called them Trumpbart. There was a lot of reason for that. But all Sleeping Giants did was say, hey, folks, you may know it or not, and frequently they didn't. This is the danger of broad programmatic ad buys. But you are advertising on Breitbart, and you may want to for political reasons. That's great. But if you're not comfortable with your content appearing on a site that has a black crime tag, then you should do something about it. And we're just going to let folks know. And what's happening in one of the positive sides of social media, and there are many, many positive sides, is that consumers are more likely to ask that brands actually live their values. And brands can't therefore say, look, we just did a broad programmatic ad spend. I have no control over where it goes, because you're sponsoring and subsidizing those sites. Now, it's not just places like Breitbart. And by the way, I want to hasten to make the fact this isn't about politics per se. I actually really resist the idea that people should be hiding from anything that might offend anybody. But there's a fundamental difference from sites that really exist to divide and provoke and demagogue, and places like, say, National Review or Weekly Standard, which are conservative publications but are rooted in ideas and philosophy and do real reporting and have real columnists that aren't simply trying to play the lowest common denominator to generate clicks. But it's not just Sleeping Giants, although I think that's a fascinating model. In March, I think it was Havas Media responded to the fact that a bunch of big advertisers, Verizon, Johnson & Johnson, Coke, Walmart, had their ads that were appearing unintentionally on YouTube across from anti-Semitic videos, extremist videos. Now, obviously, that wasn't the intention. Right? But that's what happens if you buy into a broad programmatic ad buy strategy, frequently within what you all are calling the duopoly, with good reason. And there's a sense of a diffusion of responsibility. Look, you're looking at the bottom line. It's the cheapest cost per click. Everybody gets that. But the irony is you're actually creating not only real risk to your brand, which you're allegedly trying to protect, and obviously have an interest in protecting, but you're also feeding the trolls, unintentionally. That approach to advertising is what has made fake news and hate news profitable at a very high level, because remember, the cost for creation of that is very, very low. So here's where corporate responsibility needs to start kicking in. It's actually safer and more civically responsible for brands to either, not only that, take an additional develop relationships, direct advertising relationships with people, with news sites that are doing it right, because they recognize that they need to be sustained. And at this particular jump ball, for everybody who's on a corporate board or in the corporate structure of a major corporate citizen to complain about the state of digital news and then pretend like they've got nothing to do with it, is really denial. Got an enormous amount to do with it. Where advertisers choose to spend their dollars will determine to a large extent how news evolves in our society right now at this critical moment. And so there should be a sense of purpose around this. And it isn't particularly political. It's actually about being the change you want to see and taking that responsibility, and there's a strong element of self-interest in it. Here's why. Here's the equation, tattooed on your forearm, if you take one thing. It's not earth-shakingly, breakthrough, it's blindingly obvious. Quality news, quality content attracts quality consumers. Influential journalism attracts influential readers. So if logically brands want to have their brands associated with quality content reaching influential, educated, wealthy consumers, then they would do very well to develop direct relationships that lead to real loyalty, sponsoring verticals as well as in issue areas that they're interested in, and developing a direct relationship with loyal readers that go to any particular site. I'll use the Daily Beast for a very good reason. Yeah, it's great. We reached over 1 million people a day. We've doubled in the last 3 years. But our audience is 70% millennial Gen X. It's wealthy, it's influential, it's educated, and that loyalty that our readers have, the fact that over 40% come to us direct and that our average visit's 4.5 minutes, that's the kind of stuff you can't buy. So when corporate citizens realize they need to straighten their backbone a little bit and not simply hide behind broad programmatic ad buys that can have deeply adverse results, risks for their brand, but also for society, then I think that's actually a massive opportunity for brands if they take that responsibility seriously. And some are starting to do it, and that's good news. One example, JP Morgan found its ads were advertising on a site called Hillary for Prison, and they took their broad ad buys from 400,000 to 40,000, and they found the effectiveness was improved, if anything. So this is a broader trend. There's a countervailing trend we need to be aware of as well. It's great that more people are reading news than ever before. That's wonderful news. But the countervailing trend is that while the Trump bump may be benefiting subscriptions, and I think all digital publishers are getting hip to the fact that we need to diversify revenues, that some advertisers are being told by their agencies or believe themselves that all that interest in politics is great, but it's terribly polarizing, it's therefore dangerous. There was a story in Digiday that blew me away where one person, understandably talking off the record, expressed how that they wanted their clients' ads pulled from an article about the FCC taking a run at net neutrality and internet privacy because the news was just so negative. That shouldn't be a punchline, but it is. If real news is negative and therefore potentially upsetting, then, I'm sorry the candy-colored world you've been promised hasn't materialized, but that's not where your consumers are living either. And there's a real danger to that. There's a real danger as well as a real opportunity, because if brands look at the real interest in quality news and they decide to ignore it, ultimately that means we will get less of it and we'll get more advertising on pseudo-news, things that are great, entertainment and sports, and the Daily Beast is all about the intersection of politics and pop culture, but we'll have less people investing in quality news and local news and the things that actually create a civic backbone in this country. The Romans called it bread and circuses. It made people lazy and dumb and distracted. So here too is where corporate citizens need to stand up and straighten their civic backbone and get off the bench and realize at this particular moment they need to be whitelisting sites, they need to be focusing on direct advertising relationships as part of a diversified revenue pie with quality content creators. And that's a message we can all carry forward, whether you're in the digital news business, whether you're a publisher, whether you're doing more niche products. This is actually a rally around the flag moment. And that's why I describe it as a civic stress test. All elements of our society are being tested right now. I have every confidence that we will succeed, but we will only succeed if we all take a degree of responsibility as leaders, as adults, in this moment. That passive acceptance and hoping we can just ignore the world as it goes by and everything will be fine is not sufficient to this moment, civically or in terms of our business. Right? The business model's broken. Everybody gets it. So let's try to actively fix it. And realizing these things are all interconnected. This is an amazing opportunity as well as a responsibility for our generation right now. And all the moment asks, all the moment demands is that we straighten our civic backbone and we take responsibility. We put forward quality content. We respect readers' intelligence. We build a differentiated brand because we know that's what creates real value. And we start communicating to the advertisers that they have an enlightened self-interest in supporting quality content for our society and for our industry. But thank you very much. And with that, I'll take a few questions if there's time.
John, thank you very much, John. Stay right there.
Sure.
We have time for loads of time for questions for John. So please raise your hand, and throughout the summit, if you have a question, stand and tell us who you are and who you're with, so we all get to know you. Yep.
Very good.
My name is Russ Ellis with Trusted Media Brands.
Hey, Russ.
There seems to be no distinction between commentary and news shows, and I think the general public has kind of they don't understand it. I mean, and where we're being called upon to sort of identify branded content as branded content, should there be some sort of distinction between shows that identify themselves as commentary shows?
Sure. So you're speaking specifically about cable news in this case. I do think that just as on a digital page we label opinion, I think places, people should be a little bit clearer that if they're watching Sean Hannity, they're getting opinion, and if they're watching Bret Baier, they're using news. They're watching news, or Chris Wallace, and I'm using a Fox News example. Overall innovation that's occurred, and I use that term sarcastically and cynically, by intentionally blurring those lines is incredibly dangerous. Because I think, it's fine if at the dawn of the era, Roger Ailes, late of Florida, used the positive polarization play he used his whole life and tried to create a news model that would balance the implicit bias of what he felt was in the mainstream media, and many people felt at the time. Fine. But don't label it fair and balanced, because that's not its aim, that's its excuse. And I think that blurring of distinctions has made it really dangerous, because, look, I want to apologize for getting on a soapbox, but I can't help myself. Ultimately, this is all about the country we live in, and it's about democracy. And democracy, by the way, depends upon an assumption of goodwill among fellow citizens. And what our media diet's done too often is it's convinced us that we receive definition only by demonizing other people who disagree with us. That's incredibly dangerous, and that's part of the genie we're trying to put back in the bottle. So yes, I agree with that.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Bill Ullman from
Hey, Bill.
Smithsonian. How you doing?
By the way, Bill was rocking shades and a pork pie hat in the elevator this morning early. It was very hip. I appreciate that.
I am in Florida. Great talk. Thank you so much. One of the interesting things I think about is that they used to say that the power of the press belongs to anyone who can afford one. And you saw it back in the early days of Time Magazine, or even when there were only 3 networks and Walter Cronkite was God, that there was a gatekeeper effect. You had to really have real news that people loved in order to get into one of the 3 major networks. So now you're seeing democratization of news. So there's a tension between democracy of the internet, where anyone can publish anything, and this gatekeeper. So it's more of a question like, how do you balance that? What's going to happen? Are we at a point where we're a flex point way over here that's going to come back to the days of...
Look, I think balance is exactly right. And let's not forget, balance is what we're all about in this country. Free government itself is a contradiction, right? It's a balance. A republic, a democratic republic, is a balance. I'll go back to the Founding Fathers because I just finished this book on Washington's farewell address, so my head's very much in that space part of the time. It was about walking a middle line between monarchy and the mob. Right? That's what a democratic republic's all about. So yes, we need to strike a balance that will constantly recalibrate as a society between democratization of news media in a free speech society, which is great. It's much better than the opposite extreme, which is sort of an explicitly high barrier oligarchy of community that existed when there were big 3. And I think nostalgia about those eras is totally wasted. Don't fetishize the form, look at the function. That said, I do think that there needs to be, and I think this is something that Google and Facebook are trying to address, right, as they adjust their algorithm, even in the wake of the election, when they recognized that fake news had proliferated to a point that they no longer controlled. Remember, the morning after the election, if you typed in who won the popular vote, the top story said Donald Trump, which is, of course, not true. And that fake news stories were being shared at a much higher rate than real news stories. So we need to make a distinction as platforms, as publishers, as advertisers, about the sites that are trying to do it right, recognizing that that's going to be a balance, right? There's always going to be the who will watch the watchman problem, particularly as the platforms try to police themselves. But we do need to value quality, original news sources more than places that are just making it up or trying to profit off polarization, and not just polarization, hate news and fake news. And that industry needs to recognize that, which is why I think you need to whitelist as well as blacklist. And you need to be constantly re-examining, because human error is going to be in that, and constantly recalibrating. But I think advertisers need to recognize that they have an interest in supporting quality publishers, because that's the way they'll reach a quality audience. And the absence of that isn't democracy at all. It can be the inmates running the asylum.
John, I've got two questions.
Sure.
One about source, one about solution. So you I'm not convinced that media are actually capable of driving change. I mean, some of what you described, that course of that evolution we've been seeing, sociologists might argue, look, we saw a clustering of America starting back in the early 1980s. We saw our population starting to cluster in communities of like-minded folk, and that this was actually happening on a social basis before media started catching up and leveraging it. And you could argue that it has sort of reached its height.
It predated that, by the way. I mean,
What? You would argue that it helped create that?
No, it predated that. But I'll hit that in a second.
But the argument is that there's actually a sociological, cultural basis for what we're seeing now that goes beyond media, that media in many ways is following a trend. And you could argue that this election came down to a surprising amount of personal animus between what seemed to be divided as two voter groups in a way we'd never seen before. We just don't like them, was sort of one of the things that came out of this, and that seems to be more a direct result of this kind of clustering, tribal mentality that goes even deeper than media. So I'm curious whether media fixes this.
All right, so let me, first of all, obviously the two are entwined, and they always have been. If you look at the birth of the party system in America, it's actually directly related to, in Philadelphia and Washington's first term, Jefferson and Madison form a newspaper with Philip Freneau, a classmates of Madison's, to attack the Washington administration, and they give him a job in Thomas Jefferson's State Department within the Washington administration. I mean, the birth of partisanship before there were two parties was entwined with partisan media. We've had partisan media. It's just, its influence, its dominance has fluctuated. Look, I would argue also that the deeper divisions in politics and in our society are not limited to America. It's experiential, it's urban versus rural, and it dates back to at least the Constitutional Convention. So I think the question is, how does this get elevated or weaponized in a way that's dangerous to democracy because of the fragmentation of media, but also the ubiquity of media? Look, I think another piece of all this, frankly, has been the death of local media, which has occurred, which has increased suspicion on the part of my mother's from Youngstown, Ohio. You know, Youngstown, Ohio still has the Vindicator, their local paper, but it's one of the very few. And certainly in that region, the numbers of local papers that have been died or killed off or quasi-killed off by a commoditization of their content, that's really important, right? Local news bureaus are destroyed, they're replaced with the illusion of a local paper, but basically a lot of national pablum and a smattering of local pablum. And that has withered the civic sense of investment on the part of these communities. So they see national media come in, and they perceive it from certainly the big cities and often the coasts. And that increases a sense of divide, because there's almost this condescending anthropological, tell me what it feels like to be from, West Virginia. And so look, that's also about a failure of business models. That's also about a failure of investment. That's about commodity news coming in and killing differentiation, as well as a business model being very broken. All these things are entwined, is my point. But it's going to take us making a degree of investment. How do you solve the death of local media? You're not going to solve the print media problem. But I would argue that when there are big companies or wealthy individuals from a country or a community, as there are in every state or community, there's an opportunity and an obligation to invest in a local press, whether it's print or not, right? I mean, we're going to see our first state without a newspaper at some point. And, state capitals have a tendency to be corrupt, and that's going to become exponentially more true in the absence of any kind of watchdog press. Why, for example, someone in Silicon Valley hasn't bought the San Jose Mercury News is mind-blowing to me. And that's not even talking about the Vindicator or papers, you know, in smaller places where people have a chance to really give back and rebuild a civic backbone. The rise of partisan news in the digital media era has increased a sense of alienation of citizens from one another. But we got to start somewhere. Part of the solution is going to be economic, right? Follow the money, and you change the rules, you change the game. And you change the business rules, you change the game. So we need to take a sense of responsibility there. And I think too often businesses and wealthy individuals feel like sort of passive bystanders as opposed to really actively understanding how they can affect change by changing the economics. And then it's up to us as journalists and publishers to also be the change we want to see. I think one of the ways that brand differentiation dies, and this always amazes me, is that publishers and journalists start having a sense of condescension for their readership. It's really easy to do with niche publications. They start saying, well, I personally wouldn't read that, but our readers would love it. And immediately then you've created a fundamental separation between the people you're serving and the content you're producing. And people are smart, if not always informed, and they're going to be hip to that. So one of our rules of the Daily Beast is don't write a headline you wouldn't read. You know, we don't talk down to the reader. We need to have respect for our audience's intelligence. And I think that when that gets lost, that also compounds the slippery slope of quality. So you asked a broad, sprawling question. I think there's a broad, sprawling answer. There is no silver bullet, but each of us can play a part. Consumers need to play a part, businesses need to play a part, and journalists can play a part as well.
And I just want, and on the solution
Sure.
side, where does media get its leverage? I mean,
Where does media get its leverage?
Where do we get our leverage with the two constituencies that are most important to making those changes? The distribution platforms that won't even agree that they're media, won't take on the liability and responsibility of being media, and the advertisers who, at least so far in my talking to them, there are great anecdotal examples, and you're right, we're seeing some of that, but generally the media buyers don't believe it's their responsibility. When I ask them outright, is it their responsibility to make sure that media itself is sustainable?
That's not
they don't see it as their responsibility.
I agree that's not the middleman's responsibility. I'd go straight to the CEOs. I mean, I'd go to the people with a sense of personal investment in the company and ask them to feel a sense of personal investment in their country. The media buyer's job is to get the broadest buy for the lowest bang, right? The lowest dollar amount. But I would also say, and the reason I used the examples I did, you know, the illusion of inexpensive reach through broad programmatic ad buys at being very low risk to the brand is being blown out of the water by the examples I just gave. You do a broad programmatic ad buy, you are going to be subsidizing hate news and fake news. That is by definition not safe for your brand. It's a heck of a lot more unsafe to be next to fake news and hate news than any discomfort that might exist about, you know, your brand being advertised against original journalism about the world or the United States of America. No, it's not all sunshine and puppies every day, but guess what? Quality readers consume quality content, and they're grown-ups, and they can deal with that. If you want that kind of an educated, influential audience, it makes sense to have hard news be part of your portfolio. So I would simply say pointing to those examples, pointing out that there's a trend, pointing out that this actually is in their enlightened self-interest, not necessarily their short-term self-interest, but there are plenty of examples of the broad programmatic ad buy blowing up in their face. And I think also, you know, even the heads of the platforms want to think well themselves, and they realize they've got a problem. Now, their sustained commitment to solving the problem is partly about us keeping their feet to their fire. But that's why business and advertisers is a key part of this equation in my formulation. You cannot get around that.
John Avalon. John's going to stay with us for
you.
the roundtable on this very topic. John, thank you very much. Great. And we're going to, let me ask and discuss first. Do we have our microphones up here? Yep. Here we are. Start by taking up this broader strategic question for businesses of how they both perceive and are experiencing this duopoly that we've been talking about, but also how they're starting to position themselves as companies to survive and even thrive within that context. And I'm going to ask first all of our panelists to introduce themselves and a little bit about their company. Some of them you know, some of them you don't. Bill?
Hi, Bill Condon, ESPN, sports. That's what we do.
Jason Kent, I'm with Digital Content Next, DCN. We're a trade association of about 80 premium publishers in the industry.
I'm Dan Lagani. I'm the president and CRO for Dipley. Dipley is a social entertainment publisher, and we specialize in original social video and content.
I'm Samantha Ski. I'm president and CRO for She Knows Media. We do lifestyle content and Blog Her, which is a network of women bloggers who write about everything from news to cats.
So I wanted to start. Let's set the level here and talk about what we're talking about when we talk about duopoly and we talk about where the revenue is going, and especially an argument that emerged recently, and Jason was a part of creating this argument about where that one of the real chilling parts of the revenue picture in digital is where we're actually seeing the growth. So let's start. Jason, talk to us about the calculations that you guys were making at DCN, that you made at DCN, playing off of some of the public figures that had been released, and also I think you looked at Brian Weezer's pivotal study about your analysis of where we are economically and what this duopoly economy actually looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I do that, if I can just pause, I've over 20 years in digital now. I've seen a lot of editors and been around a lot of editors, but for John to pull together the business analysis the way you did, it just should be recognized. That's phenomenal. So it's a real treat to have you here. And by the way, we're tight for this panel. I have a reputation for being very, very transparent and throwing elbows. So,
wide stance,
which transitioned me. Okay, so the duopoly. So when I came aboard 3 years ago, and my goal is always to be as transparent as possible, like call it as I see it. And the industry at that time there's this drumbeat of digital's growing 20% year over year, 20% year over year. Everything's phenomenal. Let's just cheer on the future. And we started looking at we do an annual benchmark across our members, which are all premium publishers, and looking at the actual revenue that was coming through to the publishers. And what was fairly obvious was the money wasn't making its way through. And so all of the growth in the industry at that point was very clearly going to either ad tech, which at that point we started to see that over half of the dollars in ad tech and programmatic were going to intermediaries, or it was Google, Facebook for the most part. And so it was like two and a half years ago. And then we dug deeper into that. And I think it was Morgan Stanley put out some data maybe about a year and a half ago that said 85% of the growth in the industry was going to Google and Facebook. And so at that point we started to really focus in each quarter on that number. And so the simple math of it is, if you look at let's look at 2016. Digital advertising, according to the IAB and PwC, that does the numbers for them, grew I think about $12 billion year over year. So if you look at the growth in the industry, digital advertising in the United States, it was about $12 billion. If you just look at Google and Facebook's public earnings, their SEC statements, they took a little over 11 billion of that 12 billion. So maybe 6 or so went to Google, 5 or so into Facebook. So it's not much left. And so the point being, and the thing that often needs to be understood when you look at Steve's chart, is that it just means there's a zero-sum game. It doesn't mean that there's not, our membership of 80 companies, there's a lot of pure play digital companies, TV companies, ESPN's a member, New York Times, Washington Post, et cetera. Many of them are growing very nicely. They're very happy. But it's a zero-sum game. And the money's not making its way to the content creators. And the only real arguments I hear against this, just to kind of pull the rug underneath them and we can move on to solutions, is one, I think you made this point a little bit, Steve, that we've had this over the past decades. Television in the 70s, magazine holding companies, we had a lot of concentration. But the difference is those companies actually created content. Google and Facebook don't, by definition, create content. To your point a minute ago, they don't actually take any liability for anything on their site, which is a really luxurious position. Or you look at the global numbers, which I did see on one of your slides. Well, Google and Facebook aren't even in China, and so that distorts the picture. So I'll stop there. That's the.
Well, now I want everybody else sort of to chime in on how you're experiencing what we're calling duopoly. We're all going to get tired of this word in about 5 minutes. But how in the market and how you as a business are experiencing it, because I believe, and true, that in terms of digital, all three of you publishers are experiencing digital growth year over year. Yeah. Right. So you're not in that category of contraction. So one of the things we need to do is locate where are the vulnerabilities and how are you actually experiencing living within a duopoly economy?
Yeah, I think there's definitely, granted, we're seeing some considerable growth in the digital side, which is great. But there is challenges where you see in the marketplace where clearly a lot of the display dollars that were potentially coming to us are going through Facebook. They've got a significant amount of data and information that they're leveraging, and they do a good job of pushing out in marketplace and honing in. So those dollars are potentially, we're fighting more for those dollars than we have in the past. We used to be, you look at your competitive marketplace set and you look, well, there's Fox Sports and there's Yahoo and there's AOL, but clearly if you ask anybody at ESPN who is our main competition and who should we be focused on, it's Google and Facebook. You also look at what YouTube has done in the marketplace by kind of taking some digital dollars from a video standpoint. And they're now going out there and trying to tout more, getting more linear dollars as well. So once again, you're fighting for those dollars against your normal competitive set, and more so the 800-pound gorillas, which are Google and Facebook. And not even thinking about, you look at Facebook as a whole, video, we haven't seen an effect there yet, but I know they're ramping it up. I think we're being helped by their challenges they're having right now with the content and the context of where that's running. And then another...
How are you being helped?
I think if you look, we look at this later too, but context matters. I think if you look at performance and the video, and they're out there pushing their marketplace in terms of the whole grading their homework thing with video, and you look at the starts and clients that have run there, is the feed environment, is that really the context that you really want to consume that video? And putting messages within there, where the traditional pay-per-play, where I come in, I'm watching a live stream game, and I know that I'm engaged in that content. The content's engaging enough where it's going to keep people on the page, and they're willing to pay for the toll to watch that professionally produced content or sports right that we're paying for is a pre-roll. And it's in that environment, and they're used to seeing that. And we're seeing, I think in our live stream Watch ESPN, 97% completion rates on advertising pre-rolls.
Is it really, is it in real terms resonating with your media buyers?
I think it's starting to sway back the other way. I think if you look at, as the two gentlemen before me mentioned, the issues with the content on YouTube and the potential fake news and the pretty challenging environment that we're seeing now. I think we all have friends out there on Facebook that think they're either political experts or climate experts right now. Is that the right environment to put your brand against? So I think the good thing with sports is generally it's a very engaging environment, and for the most part a pretty safe environment outside of a couple of incidents where we can potentially protect against that and not make sure that advertising does not run against that. I don't think the Facebooks and the Googles of the world can say that.
And in neither case, you're not waiting for them to share enormous amounts of revenue with you.
No.
Okay. Now, Dan, you should probably explain a little bit about Dipley, because it's a different content model. You have a very different history. You're like in stark contrast to ESPN. But tell us what Dipley is and its relationship to these platforms.
Thanks, Steve. So Dipley, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is a social entertainment publisher. And by definition, what we do, I would say, is as simple as the founders of the company inverted the process of, and I came from traditional media companies, so I have run magazines and I've been at daily newspapers like Women's Wear Daily. So I've seen the very traditional model of build the shiny place and then deal with the challenges of trying to get the consumer to your shiny place, whether that's a magazine or a newspaper or even a website. What Dipley does is publish original videos and articles that are lifestyle driven in things like food and crafts and entertainment, but we publish directly into social platforms. So most of you in your businesses have a couple of people that think about what your social strategy is. We have 170 people, and our strategy is it's social as our native platform. So every month we publish roughly 1,200 to 1,500 original videos and stories directly into Facebook, into Instagram, and into platforms like that. And we, from there, wind up driving now globally 250 million entrances to our website every month. And this is from a business that's about 3.5 years old now. So we
And monetizing mainly on site.
Monetization, yes, is mainly on site. There is also some monetization on Facebook and on other social platforms through some of our branded entertainment content. But it is largely a business that is native social distribution that results in traffic on Dipley.com.
Sam.
So by definition, and I'm sorry, Sam, but by definition,
Go ahead.
I'm on the other side of a lot of this conversation, and what I do want to come back to is the notion that somehow it exists almost even in our panel, is that everything about Facebook and Google is inherently bad for our business, and I don't believe that that's the case. And I think that our businesses, like Dipley, have given rise to ways to make money and benefit in a positive way. So that's what I do want to come back to.
Okay.
I agree. Okay, so she knows the way that we're feeling this duopoly tension is as a kind of mid-sized publisher who is we reach about 70 million people, and we do a lot of it through networks, so about 40 million are O&O. And I think that while our revenues are increasing, I think the bottom line is the main problem for us, because the compression of CPMs that is inherent in programmatic buying or even audience-based buying still requires for us the same amount of editorial work, the same amount of marketing work, a full social team. So I think we're just figuring out what business model works best, or just how to modify by modicrums the business model that we have so that we can continue to grow in advertising revenue. We're almost half programmatic at this point, and I love that. I think it's a great business. When you want to buy audience, we have a high value audience, so we drive pretty premium CPMs, and I don't need a whole team of difficult sellers to do it. So I'm happy with that growth. I just have to acknowledge that until context is valued in a very quantifiable way, that a lot of my revenue is going to come from audience targeting, which does not support the cost of editorial.
So is your main vulnerability, or the way you're experiencing this economy, is one where it's simply the effect of the duopolies, their impact on overall CPMs that everyone's used to, or that you're actually losing business to these platforms?
Yeah, well, the losing business is one thing, just to continue on that, certainly, but those Facebook and Google guys are audience targeters. They're not context targeters for the most part, so that has brought advertisers into a realm where the majority of the tech they're building and that they're investing in is driving audience buying, and they have enormous audiences with high frequency. I think the mobile and video trends are likewise best suited in many cases to platforms. So it's not an evil thing. It's audience targeting is really, really good type of advertising.
I wanted to draft off of this into the next set of questions about where you identify your main weaknesses in the market that the platforms are exposing, where you feel most vulnerable, or where major media companies now have sort of the least best response. And certainly audience is one place. But Bill, when you're up against when you've got media buyers who are looking at you as opposed to the platforms, where are you the most vulnerable right now?
I think if you look at what Facebook and Google have in terms of, especially Facebook, in terms of the data, they're doing a good job of monetizing their data and marketing their data. I think a big push for us is to get more folks to personal, like it's a value exchange. There's a reason why it's very clear when you go to Facebook what information you're putting in and why you're putting it in, because you're a real person. And then in terms of all the activities that they're doing across our platform, they're mining that and then saying, okay, and then cutting it up and selling it to advertisers. I think our weakness is the fact that we do have a significant scaled audience, 90 million plus on a monthly basis. We have we have a lot of information on them. We need to do a better job of actually packaging that and giving the benefit to advertisers to access that in campaigns. We've just, about a year ago, started something called Live Connect, which is tapping into the personalization. So someone's raised their hand and said, okay, I'm Bill, I'm a New York Mets fan, I'm generally miserable because of that. But just imagine, so Cleveland Cavaliers last night, so Dick's Sporting Goods is bought into this campaign called Live Connect, and it's tapping into the real-time emotion of the sports fan. We know who you are, we know where you are in your fandom, and how do we serve relevant messages to you. So last night, end of the game, or even during the game, we're gonna shoot you a Dick's Sporting Goods, really simplistically, we'll send you a jersey ad for Kevin Durant, because he went off last night. Very straightforward, but just imagine Allstate's also a part of this. So imagine, you're going into that game with either high anticipation or high anxiety. So based on where you are in your fandom, you've raised your hand, you've told us who you like, who you don't like, serving relevant ads. So maybe at that point, serving them a message on safety because they're very anxious, or serving something else. We've seen some tremendous results. So I think a very long-winded way of saying is doing a better job of tapping into our audience and data, and I think we're starting to move there, but clearly they have a bit of a lead.
Not compete on scale. Don't try to compete on scale, but compete on depth, right?
Compete on depth, and I do think
they don't have, that Facebook
depth.
doesn't
I still think,
right.
and a majority of this panel has said, it's context and relevancy. So serving that message, just because Facebook knows who they are at that specific time, is it as relevant serving them that ad across either their audience network or within the feed, or is it more relevant serving that ad in a recap of last night's game? And I think the relevancy and the adjacency to relevant content helps drive that message. And that's something that those guys can't offer.
Dan, where's the weakness in your model? I mean, yes, the platforms are driving tremendous traffic for you. That's how you grew. That's how a number of digital first and social first sites grew over the last few years. But you also have to live within a programmatic ecosystem that they helped invent and in which they tend to glom a lot of the money and tend to take up Sam's point, tend to suppress CPMs. So what's the weakness for you?
Well, Steve, I think it goes back to that every business has some potential threat to it. But if we took it a level up for a second and said, what is it as publishers, regardless of content category or platform that we're expert in, what do we all have to contend with? And I think we have to contend with right now that you have a consumer, in particular if you're millennial focused or younger, that is social in their media behaviors, that is using a mobile device as their primary consumption platform. And as we've seen, at least in our business, quite profoundly, is very much from a form factor engaging with video as the thing that they're most interested in. So I think for anyone who is a content creator, you need to be able to contend with and build your business model around the fact that your consumer is engaging and discovering content, at very least lifestyle content, in social platforms, not through search. So you need to build your business that way. You need to be able to build your business so that it resonates and is centered around mobile as the consumption platform. And as our focus has very clearly been over the last year that I've been at Dipley, increasingly a video-driven medium. So that's where the focus is, and I think that's where failure to convert in any of those areas puts you at risk.
So thank you. You just pivoted us into the topic of context, because all of you have raised the question of context. Jason, you chime in.
Well, I was just going to say, because you asked about the weaknesses, the weakness of living in a two-platform world, or maybe three if you are ambitious about Snapchat. I mean, one thing that gets lost with Snapchat is, although it's where all the growth is, from a revenue perspective, WPP spent, I think, $70 million with Snapchat last year, and they spent $6 billion with Google. So they're not even on the horizon yet. So if you just think about, if you're living inside these platforms, the revenue and the profit always accrues to whoever controls the distribution. So you can, if you're familiar with the Zynga case story of living inside of Facebook, you can pretend that you've got this great long-term business, but they can at any point turn the dial. And if you don't have real competition there, you're in trouble. I also worry greatly about, the real value as a media company isn't just the creation of the content. It's the curation of it, determining the priorities of it, knowing your audience. It's the context of the brand. It's actually the selling of the advertising. It's the navigation. It's the production of the content, which in the print world was the magazine, but for us it's hosting your website. We've now turned all that over to Facebook. With instant articles in particular, Facebook has a scheme where they're doing all the selling for the most part because there's no way you can really sell against them because they have all the data. So they're hosting the content, they're selling the content, they're curating the content, they're navigating the content, and all you're doing is creating the content. And if you're creating the content and you've lost the brand that goes with it, then you're down to just that single piece of content. And the most profitable content is always going to be the cats or the entertainment content to get the single click. You're never going to do that long form ISIS piece or whatnot because it doesn't make any economic sense. And that's concerning.
Dan? There's
There is a lot there, so I
Go
don't know
ahead,
what
go ahead.
specifically that you
Well,
want me
all right,
to respond to.
let's-
Build a long-term brand
Let's
business.
start with that. At any moment, how is your business model not at risk of at any moment Facebook turning down the dial, changing the algorithm in a way that's going to disadvantage your content and gut your business?
Well, again, there's a lot packed in there, and I would say that by definition, the question assumes that building a business that really understands that, at least in lifestyle, and I do differentiate it from news, by the way. I look at, there's a couple of heavily sort of, powerful terms that get thrown around like fake news, and consumers are choosing to discover, and by the way, all of this is driven by the consumer in my view. It's not really being driven by media companies that have decided to actually lead the consumer. The consumer is leading, and the consumer has, at least in lifestyle content, decided that it is more than acceptable to discover things that are interesting to them about crafts, about food, about fun and interesting diversions in their lives. They're very comfortable discovering that in a social platform. So I think it's tantamount in many respects to, if you are a manufacturer or a vendor that 20 years ago suddenly discovered that selling in your local hardware store wasn't going to be the way that you competed, but you needed to be able to craft a relationship with Home Depot or Lowe's. I think that's the way that a modern publisher in the lifestyle space has to view a Facebook, a Google, a Snapchat. And would we all love to have 10 meaningful options? Sure, absolutely. Did I like my life and the simplicity that came with it when I ran Better Homes and Gardens and got an insertion order from Procter & Gamble for 125 pages that was, going to be delivered through 12 pieces of creative, and it all happened at the beginning of the year? Sure. I mean, who wouldn't like that sort of simplicity and that sort of control? But you now decide that you either don't adapt or that you do adapt. So I think that there's certain, in every business, again, there's risk, but I look at it as, if you craft your business in a way that stays true to the consumer, then you can build your business in a way that makes the most of each of the platforms.
No,
I was just thinking that I totally agree with everything you said, except that the impact scares me a little more, because I think of myself like putting my Us magazine in the middle of The Economist, because I don't want to be seen reading essentially the fluff. And if the fluff is served up to you perpetually, for my kid, that is what she's addicted to. She's not reading or watching long-form content. So while it is the consumer that's leading us, I think we are reacting quickly as media companies and throwing crazy-ass headlines out there so that we can have, sort of level up in the fluff or in the, like, that feeling of like, oh my God, I see this thing and it's so satisfying. All I have to do is like give a moment's attention and I have something, and I'm watching my 12-year-old do this. So it's, I'm a little more concerned maybe about us, following the consumer down that path of cats and gross food combinations and things like that. I don't think Dipley's doing that, but But so it concerns me a little more. At the same time, with that fragmentation, or I'm sorry, that compression of CPM, it's more expensive to produce good content. Is the other, or not good? I'm saying good, but longer, more informed content that's researched. We have like our experts. We've got 20,000 of them, and they aren't experts. Maybe don't tweet that, but they think they are because they know something about something, and that's where lifestyle is interesting because you can do that. That's not offensive to your consumer because we're not claiming to be medical professionals. Anyway, I think that was a messy response, but it concerns me, and I do think there might be a flip at some point if we can prove context and prove the depth of engagement, not just that super superficial engagement, has more meaning and more value, more quantifiable, monetizable value, that maybe we'll see that model evolve.
Well, let's talk about how the hell we do that. Because context is the term that keeps on coming up here. We need to prove context, the value of context. And somehow, we have not done a great job of communicating that. So let's talk a little bit about where, that's why I asked that follow-up question, are you making headway with media buyers on the superior value of that safer context and that more immersive context?
Yeah, I do think there's a move back to quality, and quality is context. I think if you looked at our upfront this year, the big message was, there's the quality of our brand, and I think we haven't heard this term in a while, so I'll bring it back up again, but the clean, well-lit environment. Because there's a lot of scary places on the internet, and do you want adjacency against ISIS content, which happened to P&G a couple of years ago? Do you want to be put against anti-Semitic content? No. I think it is upon us to prove that. Do you think we have some case studies, the Live Connect stuff that I mentioned before, the adjacency, the relevancy? It's just either banding together, like working with the DCN to figure this out, because we have studies and we've proven that context and relevancy, but even just from an emotional standpoint, look back, like the ads that stand out, the context of something like the Super Bowl or the Olympics, or I think it was last year, Nike did a really great piece after the Cubs won the World Series. They shot this beautiful 60-second commercial, and as soon as the Cubs won, they had it ready. I'm sure they had one ready for Cleveland as well. But this commercial ran right after the game, and it was super impactful. Or all the P&G commercials that you're seeing that run against Olympic content, like who doesn't cry? Like that, the pure emotion of that and the relevancy is, so yeah, I think it's a combination of the head and the heart. Like you can, good relevancy and emotion when you see it, but it's how do we make that quantifiable?
It needs to be, I think it needs to be quantified. These are great case
by
studies.
third party.
I need to see them. When I'm writing about media, I need to see those case studies and put them forward, because I remember, again, the old fart goes back to 2001, 2002, when it cratered, and nobody believed in digital advertising anymore, and it came back mainly on the back of relentless case studies, brand lift studies. Because these guys, the media buyers, they needed the metrics. They needed
you need
it to be
third party.
proven.
Case studies are self-interested for all of us, even though they might be true. I think, why isn't a third party, Jason?
Well, I mean, the best research I've seen in the last year on this was ComScore put out something called the Halo Effect, which scared me for a minute, frankly, because we were out there as an organization so much talking about trust and context and the value in a broader picture, and they decided to actually do a brand study on the effectiveness of advertising across a bunch of major advertisers, I think 15, and they actually looked at DCN members versus the rest of the web without us knowing. So they literally got a phone call that said, we just studied you for the last 3 months, and so I said, okay, what does it say? And the results were phenomenal, but they called it the Halo Effect because once they backed out the stuff we were all talking about in terms of human, fraud versus viewability, et cetera, there was still this massive lift that came with premium publishers, and they couldn't. That's the halo. What is that worth? And so, on a broader picture, I think it's worth pointing out. I mean, the issue we've been talking about is this breakdown in trust between three stakeholders that matter: consumers, advertisers, and publishers. And it's all happening because of this move towards automation. Automation is absolutely the future. We should all be embracing it. We should be embracing Facebook and Google as platforms. We need to figure it out. But with that automation, we're actually depending more and more on just this movement of audience and cookies and targeting, and we're losing context. And we're losing the value of the brand, and we're losing sight with what we're actually doing business with. So when you're on Facebook, you often don't really care about the brand when you're scanning your newsfeed. That's a problem. When you're buying advertising, you don't know where your ads are actually running, that's a problem. And so we've got more and more research coming out to prove this. And I do think Bill's right that we're going to move back where we marry scale and automation with context. And that's the sweet spot for a company like you. And we put out research on fraud a year and a half ago. White Ops, big security firm, came in and did this massive study on ad fraud. The industry was measured on video at 23% of video was bots. 23% of video advertising was bots. Our membership was under 3%. ESPN was the one member who publicly went out with their number because they were number one. Mm-hmm. It was like, I don't remember, it was like 2%, right? The less of that research was know where your video ads are actually running. 23% wider web, 2% ESPN. That's an easy calculation.
You know, I want to address, because I think it's a very valid point that you raise, which is that, from the perspective of programmatic, from a business perspective, from a structural perspective, I think that every one of us has to build our businesses with the assumption that programmatic just continues to grow. If you want the corollary to that, look what happened on Wall Street with respect to, you don't need specialists on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange to actually be a middleman between a buyer and a seller. And I don't believe that that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that it's digital is fundamentally too complicated a business to have it sold in the majority through people-to-people transactions. I think people will always play an important role, but by definition, the technology is not a bad thing. And I think what I've seen quite directly over the past 6 to 8 months is the move towards whitelists and is the move towards transparency. But as every brand, if you're in the position now of being able to demonstrate that you can deliver real people, the right people, and the right level of engagement, you don't have a business going forward. But with that, I think also comes that programmatic CPMs will continue to rise. And to me, that's what the future brings with it. And I think that we've seen a lot of positive innovation towards transparency, almost the same way that 3 years ago, the notion of viewability, the reaction that publishers first had to the idea of viewability metrics, we're seeing that around programmatic now, and the importance of being able to transparently defend and to derive value from doing that, where your ads are delivered and who your audience is that's seeing it. So.
Sam, you fundamentally had to change the business model at She Knows, in large part because of programmatic.
Well,
and talk to us about how you're leveraging it in your favor,
Yeah.
but what the Sturm und Drang that went into it.
Yeah, well, it wasn't like my first choice, but I think that our revenue remains advertising, so I wouldn't say it's a full shift of business model, but it's certainly a shift in the humans we hire and the way we comport ourselves daily and the metrics we look at. So we had, the classic, like Dan's experience, sales team, attractive people who go out and have meals and do things with clients and curry favor, and then you ultimately get the buy, and some piece of that buy probably is really, really valuable, and some piece might not be. Some piece is your target audience, but it's probably not as good advertising as it can be today, going through pipes that will show you more about that audience match. So that's just in favor of programmatic. We are getting rid of, in many cases, the middle layer, which means we have to get a heck of a lot better at the automated version. So I've been investing much more in the humans and the type of humans, analytic sellers, revenue operations people who are interested in looking every hour at the yield. Yield management's become a huge thing for us. I didn't even know that I knew that term like 5 years ago. So I think that's for us a shift. Editorial is where I'm still figuring it out. We definitely do leverage, sort of in a similar way, but not as newfangled. We leverage humans who produce content. We have 20,000 influencers or bloggers who are producing content, and we're generating revenue from them. That becomes less and less valuable as we learn that you don't have to have amassed a big audience as a content contributor in order to be valuable. You could have 1,000 people, each of whom has amassed a very small audience, but they're a very loyal audience. So our business model is continuing to evolve as the needs of the sort of the industry evolve. And it's holding on to, I guess, figuring out what we hold on to. especially in the space of editorial, is the thing that's most up for grabs.
Go ahead, Jason.
Just a data point, because we do a benchmark I mentioned earlier for our members, and we haven't actually distributed this yet, so sorry, Bill. But the impressions are still moving towards open exchanges and what I would call blind programmatic. And so there's discussion about private marketplaces where you actually know where your ads are running.
That's half our business. It's not just a discuss. PMP is over half our business now.
Great.
Yeah,
That's great.
I think that's what most big brands are doing.
So
No, but you're saying you're actually, I thought we were seeing generally movement towards private marketplaces.
we
away from
are
open.
seeing movement, but in a broad impression basis, direct is actually moving, direct sales, humans selling is still moving to open exchanges from a volume perspective.
Okay.
I think that, so it's going to take time. There's nothing more important to publishers in particular than accelerating that. If you're being bought and sold in an open exchange where you don't actually know where the ads are running, there's always going to be a cheaper place for those ads to target those cookies or that user. There's always going to be cheaper, crappier, fake content even, to find that audience, if that's all that matters is reaching that user. And so that push towards transparency and towards private marketplaces, which drive a higher CPM, is vital. And we need to press harder and harder on that.
And technically, this programmatic should, in the end, we're going to talk a little bit about this tomorrow in header bidding, but generally, it really should, that data and that transparency should help make the case for the superiority of superior context.
Yes.
Ultimately, they should be seeing, media buyers on the other end, if it's fully transparent, if they know where stuff is going, if they can compare the performance on your site to someone else's, the numbers should be telling them that superior context equals superior ad impact, whether it's performance or brand. But apparently it's, but I'm not, yeah, from my mouth to God's ears. but at least theoretically, so part of what we need to accelerate is that part of it, that the data is transparent enough and we're constantly making that case.
Yeah, there'll be more and more pressure as TV has slowed and print has kind of fallen off a cliff, that they're going to be looking for performance, particularly on the brand side, and digital is sitting there ripe for that. And
Right.
so I think it's on us to prove it.
Yeah, no, I think agree with everyone on the panel in terms of our goal is to move as much as possible to the PMPs, and once again, control your own destiny, but also make it advantageous. What data can you use, like tapping into the data and the sources that we have. Okay, out in the open exchange, you're not going to be able to come back and know this person's a sports fan or this person's this. So make the inventory work harder and give the advertisers an option that they cannot get in the open exchange. And there is still a relation, even though it's all done by robots, it's not really done by robots. It's having that relationship and controlling that and showing the value of what a PMP can bring versus an open exchange. And it's not just spots and dots, and we're not commoditizing ourselves in our business.
In our remaining minutes, I wanted to ratchet through a few possible ways in which publishers outside the duopoly can gain some leverage and scale. For instance, in all the many years that I've been covering media, I have always seen attempts to aggregate premium publishers in one way or another, aggregate their inventory, now I hear more about attempts to, in various combinations and partnerships that aggregate the data. Because part of the problem is Google and Facebook simply have scale. So tell me a little bit about where we are in that landscape of publishers partnering up, aggregating inventory data to try to gain a greater sense of leverage in the premium space.
I think there's a couple different things. So in regards to, from the programmatic standpoint, kind of what we're doing with TrustX through DCN, it's a trusted environment. The only premium publishers that are allowed to access this. So you kind of reminds me of the old, and granted, I don't think I'm dating myself here, the PSAs you used to see on television. It's 10 o'clock, do you know where your kids are?
Right.
Like, okay, it's 10 p.m., do you know where your ads are? Okay, they're running across these premium publishers.
They're both on Facebook or Instagram, both your ads and your kids.
Yeah. And I think there's another thing, and I forget who's, maybe the IAB is pushing this out, like the .txt tags to put on sites to know, okay, this content is, sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here, I'm getting lost in the lights. Yeah, I think there's a big push, and there's other things in terms of, besides aggregating other publishers' data, like keep your friends and your frenemies closer. We announced, as part of this beta partnership with Facebook last week, we're participating in Facebook Audience Direct, which allows us to control the sell our video inventory across our properties, but using Facebook's data to target on that. So it's just how do you leverage that partnership by still keeping them in the mix, but have more of a control over what's going on.
Jason, why don't you talk about TrustX and why is this going to work?
I mean, that, you know, from a cooperative perspective, yeah, it's 33 of our members already, and we're basically rebuilding everything from the exchange through to the publisher under a nonprofit. So complete financial transparency with the intention of making sure as much of the ad dollars from the marketer can get through to reaching humans in a place where you know the ads are actually running. So human, viewable, et cetera. We very quietly put it together over the last year, and it's in beta now. So it's there and working, and but it's got everybody from ESPN to CBS to NBC to Washington Post, Vox Media, I mean everybody. So I think that's interesting. I also again, you have to work with these platforms. A lot of the audience does want to consume this content inside of Facebook. You need to figure that out. We did a study across our members, 30-page study. About 15 pages made its way out into the public. But we did the economic analysis on what was really happening. But we also did best practices, which didn't get enough press. The headlines were all about only 15% of the revenue is coming through from distributed platforms. It doesn't justify itself. Put that aside. There were best practices in there. Making sure that your negotiations with Facebook and Google happen as high up in your company as possible. That's how they win, is picking you apart, especially inside the big TV companies. They go to the producers, the digital people, and they just try to pick you apart. So move the negotiations up, making sure you're getting the data rights and the analytics, et cetera. Google and Facebook's main source of value in terms of this duopoly is the data that they have, and not just from their O&O properties, not from their own, just from Google.com and search, and from Facebook's app. You all, for the most part, most publishers have like buttons on every one of their pages, and you have GA, Google Analytics, running every one of your pages. Well, Google last summer merged their cookie pools between GA, Gmail, and DoubleClick. That should frighten everyone. And people are paying attention on the regulatory side, but you should also, from an economic perspective, pay attention to how much data you're giving them for free, that they're now licensing back to you in the form of revenue sharing. And so push back as individual companies as much as you can on those terms. I could go down. We have a bunch of them.
Dan, final words on partnering up with others and other revenue streams.
I think that the key thing is the second part of it, which is other revenue streams. There's always going to be opportunities to partner with people. I think over time, those sort of federations are hard to sort of really build your business around. I think you look for the opportunities where you can. But I think the alternative revenue streams are really, in my view, what become interesting. Because for an entirely different panel on a different day, you could debate what's the value of advertising in an era where there isn't simply that choke point that the media companies play between big brands and consumers. When you can engage the consumer directly at scale, it puts pressure on advertising overall. So wherever possible, to me, as we look out the next 3 years, the next 5 years, which is an eternity in the media business, it's beyond advertising and beyond the fact that, yes, we need to take advantage of the opportunities around mobile and around video. Are there consumer opportunities around subscription revenue? Are there consumer opportunities around, in our case, social commerce? Those are meaningful additional forms of revenue, and I think the smart things for companies to continue to focus on, in addition to adapting to a world that'll be transacted programmatically.
Sam?
Yeah. That PMPs. I think that adapting to a world that doesn't. I don't want to adapt to a world that doesn't recognize context. Right now, PMPs is the first step towards that because they at least want to know what domains they're on, but it's still not recognizing why that person cries when the Olympic ad, follows the Olympics inserts a P&G ad about moms, or ESPN rally, when their consumers are in the midst of a rally cry, puts out an ad that will stoke you up when you're already stoked. I think that's super important and will benefit many of us if we can prove that third and other ad. I think it would be very cool analysts and instead media company, because it would be interesting to see that funding change, because otherwise writers and journalists seem like they are going to be on the bad side of this.
Do we have some time for questions? Anybody have any questions of the panel? Okay.
Hello, I'm Taylor. I work at Index. For the old timers, it's of Kasali legacy.
That's mean.
I have a
You
question.
said double click.
Oh, and that. There's a few old double clickers there too. But I have a question for you, Sam. Your company's done an amazing job of building your own tech, which I think is pretty rare for publishers. And I was wondering how much of your success you attribute to owning your own technology, and if you think that that's maybe a path to disavow from this duopoly that we're all terrified about.
Okay, that was such a prompt and such a, like, you can tell I'm a client of hers. That was awesome. I love you, Taylor.
Plant.
Yeah, total plant. I mean, I didn't arrange it, but yeah, we created an kind of an ad injector type of technology that allows us to run ads all over our, a network of several thousand sites, and to do so within a context of viewability at minimum and within target based on content subject heading. I think having some degree of your own tech, it's super hard because we're competing with extremely good technologists over there at Google, Facebook, et cetera. But that has helped us a ton, and being able to work programmatically with our own tech that allows us to collect the data, because first-party data, I think, is another.
And you're realizing a higher share of the spend. Yep. Right.
Because and they get hooked on you. They have to keep working with you, the sites that you roll out on.
All right, well, we're going to do a roundtable on this very topic in about an hour. But I want to thank Bill, Jason, Dan, and Sam. Thanks very much.
Thank you for having us.
We're going to have a coffee break, but before we do, our sponsor for the
people in the audience that know who Julie McCoy is.
That's right. We are throughout this. We have been straining the age barrier for all of our references so far. But hey, I want to introduce our coffee break sponsor in a second. But just a word about sponsors, and I'm taking a bit of liberty here because I'm the editorial side. I want to do a special thanks to our sponsors, and this drafts off a little bit of what John was talking about before. When somebody sponsors a MediaPost show, they know they're buying into independent journalism, and that they know that they don't buy influence on what I put on stage. We don't do pay to play at MediaPost. All the content we put on stage is thoroughly independent of the sponsors who are good enough to sponsor us. So when they buy us and they buy into this, they know that they don't get to put somebody on a panel. They don't get to influence what I put on stage. And I think that's important, and that's an important value. And I personally, as a journalist, I thank them, and I want all of them. And I want to bring up as our to speak for a few minutes our lunch. Flynn, the Director of Business Development. Please welcome Eamon.
Thank you very much. Thank you. How's everyone doing? That was an awesome conversation, that last presentation. I really enjoyed it. So yeah, I'm a VP of Business Development for Traverse. I'm not going to keep you too long. I'm just going to give you a few words so we can get to the coffee. So Traverse was founded in 2015. Basic aim was to help publishers find a new revenue stream from their registration data. So right now we have a network of about 70 publishers. We're constantly adding more. And we're helping them securely license that data to various ad tech companies. The data is used to power more accurate data-driven products for ad tech companies. So, you're talking about building device graphs, website personalization, optimization, onboarding, and we're also working on a new email retargeting product, which we're pretty excited about. So we work with quite a wide range of publishers to help them improve their current monetization tactics, I guess, or also with those who are new to the concept. So we're very open to having conversations with any publishers who would like to learn more. Most importantly, though, we're having a little giveaway. So we have an awesome Traverse watch with a GPS, altitude reader, kind of a James Bondy type device. So one lucky winner will win this following our little networking and coffee break. To enter, all you have to do is follow us on Twitter, @TraverseData. I think that's on the screen beside. Yeah, @TraverseData. Or you can tweet at us, or you can give Rachel is down there. You can give Rachel or me your business card at the break. We're going to be set up just by the coffee, so please feel free to come over, chat with us. We'll tell you some more. And that's it. Let's go and have some coffee. Cheers.
All right. All right. Thanks so much, Eamon. Appreciate it. Thank you, sir. All right. So let's take about 10 minutes.